Welcome to the Unique History Channel. Today we'll be reading Status Without Stature, Newfoundland, 1869 to 1949, from Canada and the British Empire. Newfoundland, whose territory included both the island and Labrador, was the smallest of the colonies and settlement in terms of population to become a self-governing dominion. Its society, culture, and politics were in many ways similar to the other British North American colonies. But unlike its neighbors, it chose not to join the Canadian Confederation or the United States. Newfoundland's experiment with independence gave it a distinct, in some ways, unique history, and certainly provided the imperial government with a series of unusual problems. The rejection of Confederation in 1869 general election was so overwhelming that the word Confederate became a political slur, and Confederation ceased to be a subject of rational debate, at least in public. Ottawa and London were not perturbed. Neither had tried to influence the election, and both probably assumed Newfoundland would confederate sooner rather than later. The colony was seen as unimportant and a backwater, yet it was potentially problematic because of its small population. It was not a significant market for the British or Canadian goods, and Newfoundland's main export, salt codfish, was sold in the Caribbean, where it competed with the Canadian product and Southern Europe. Nor did it attract immigrants. Indeed, a significant migration to Newfoundland, almost exclusively from southwestern England and southeastern Ireland, had ended in the 1830s. So as long as Newfoundland was British, there was no chance of that changing. Its decision had little immediate impact. But Newfoundland's independence denied Canada full control over the eastern coast fisheries and thereby complicated Canada's relationships with the United States. Reciprocity involved bargaining over the fisheries for diplomatic purposes, and it was convenient to treat British North America as a single unit. Newfoundland initially acquiesced in this approach, but in the 1880s was becoming impatient. In both Canada and Newfoundland were subject to the 1818 Anglo-American Fisheries Convention, where they could differ over questions of interpretation and enforcement. The affairs of Newfoundland, except where they are insignificant, are imperial, noted Sir Robert Herbert, permanent Undersecretary of the Colonial Office. In 1890, he was referring not to the convention with the United States, but to the so-called French treaty store question, which dominated relationships between Newfoundland and Downing Street in the 19th century. French fishing rights at Newfoundland dated back to the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, when France recognized British sovereignty over the island, with condition that French fishermen could continue to use part of the coast in season. In addition, that the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon had been seceded in 1763 as the base for French vessels shipping off the offshore banks. By the 1860s, French fishery on the treaty shore between Cape St. John and Cape Ray was in decline. While the French bank fishery was on the verge of major expansion, both fisheries caused significant tensions. France claimed an exclusive right of fishery to the treaty shore and held that British subjects who were settled there did not so by the right but by the French permission, and that the French authorities could regulate how they fished and where they built their houses. In seizing the shore, French, patrolled by a French naval squadron, and the British government, uncertain about what rights the French actually possessed, acquiesced in a normal state of affairs about in the 1850s to deal with the increasing volume of protests from St. John's, where it was held that Newfoundlanders had every right to fish on the shore concurrently with the French, and could settle and do whatever they wanted, so as long as the French fishery was not disrupted. The British interpretation was eventually emerged, and it fell between extremes. Colonial governments were also concerned about Saint-Pierre and the French offshore fishery because it encouraged large-scale smuggling along the island's south coast, linked to the sale of bait into the French banking vessels produced fish by the 1880s, was competing seriously with Newfoundland exports in the European markets. The injury was intensified by the fact that the French fisheries were generously subsidized. In short, the sovereignty of the colonial government and its ability to exploit and regulate its major resource was significantly and uniquely limited by treaties arranged before the country had ever received colonial status in 1825. The British view is that when Newfoundlanders had requested their first representative in 1832, and responsible government in 1855, they had done so in understanding that such limitations would exist. In any event, the imperial government insisted that imperial treaty obligations could be upheld no matter what Newfoundlanders think or might want. As the colonial secretary, Lord Cavernon, put it in 1875, the power of self-government and responsibility of the local administration are necessarily distinctly limited by the facts and affairs of the colony are complicated by the existence of a difficult question to which Her Majesty's government has to deal with as a foreign power. This attitude was resented in the colony, and not surprisingly, the French question became a patriotic touchstone. Any politician who discussed compromise did so at his peril. The dispute helped foster a mentality of victimization and provided a scapegoat for a variety of failings. The St. John's Daily News argued on June 13, 1898, that so long as the most fertile half of the island is to a certain extent under French domination, we have no home rule, and we cannot so long there is a dual authority in any part of the island. Thus, as then Premier Robert Bond said in 1900, the colony's backwardness was a national disgrace to England, and Newfoundlanders had no need to be ashamed, for we could not alter it in one iota. We've been handicapped in the march of progress by imperial interdiction on one hand and French aggression on the other, and thus have been subjugated to an imputation of inferiority neither we merit or feel. The argument fit into a nationalist view of Newfoundland history, in which emerged in 1815 and fast became the orthodoxy. Hardly any Newfoundlanders had always had to struggle against imperial indifference, hostility symbolized by the West Country merchants, fishing admirals, and naval governments who had collectively managed the 18th century migratory fishery, opposed the growth of settlement, harassed the settlers, and there the burden imposed ancient treaties. Lord Salisbury once referred to Newfoundland as the sport of historic errors, and in the colony, significantly, the phrase became a sport of historic misfortune. Newfoundlanders had never had a break in the 450 years of our history, said a politician in 1947, and the tradition lives on. These resentments, however, coexisted with pride in being part of the British Empire, loyalty to the backbone, as the newspaper put it in 1865. A central issue was the administration competence of the colonial government on the treaty shore, where it had no presence whatsoever. The colonial office moved with extreme caution, eventually allowing the appointment of magistrates in 1878 and the enfranchisement of settlers in 1882 over strenuous French protests. But land and other such grants were hedged about which conditions the local fisheries legislation was gradually impeccable. Since the French insisted on extraterritoriality, when a railway was built in the island in 1890s and western terminus had to be sited by the French limits, in 1880s, the colonial politicians lost patience with a gradual, step-by-step approach and allotted an aggressive, confrontational policy, which irritated both London and Ottawa. In essence, the colonial government decided to attack the French offshore fishery by placing an embargo on the export of bait from Newfoundland's south coast. This would, as it was hoped, reduce both the French catch and market competition. At the same time, they gave expiry of the fishery clauses by the Treaty of Washington in 1874. The government proposed to allow American banking vessels to bait, return for free entry of Newfoundland products into the United States, an independent reciprocity treaty. Canada objected to the potential breach and to hit their hoe united from the reciprocity, and the imperial government to legislation that France would obviously interpret as yet another hostile British action. Nevertheless, the Bait Act was eventually allowed, and as it feared, participated in a major crisis. Though French banking vessels adapted to the changed circumstances, the act was deeply resented, and the French authorities became determined to hold on to the treaty shore and enforce their interpretation of French rights. As part of this initiative, they encouraged the development of the lobster fishery, which was not innocent as it sounds. The Newfoundland government held that since the treaties only mentioned fish, the French were not to catch lobsters, yet alone can them, to which the French retorted they were entitled to take any can or fish or whatever to process they saw fit. The disagreement escalated because the imperial government in 1890 insisted that the commodores of the French and British naval squadrons would regulate the treaty shore lobster fishery under an Anglo-French modus vivendi, pending arbitration. It was then discovered that the imperial legislation authorizing the enforcement of the treaties had lapsed, and that the British commodore forcibly closed a Newfoundland-owned cannery in St. George's Bay, and in order to suit him for trespass. The imperial government's action created great indignation in the colony. Talks in London generally treaty shore settlement ended in a deadlock, and a colonial government refused to provide statutory authority for naval officers. Salisbury concluded the only solution was the imperial legislation. Britain was bound by treaty obligations to the French, which we must fulfill. He told the cabinet we run a considerable risk by not fulfilling them, since irresponsible behavior on the shore could lead to international incident. It is needless to say that all risks of war are with us. In Newfoundland, the legislation was immediately christened the Coercion Bill. I fear that we have a transatlantic Ireland of the lower type on hand, sniffed the governor, and legislature dispatched a delegation to London, where a deal was worked out. The colony agreed to pass temporary enforcement legislation, and Premier Sir William Whiteway negotiated the terms of permanent legislation. The arbitration was postponed since France refused to participate until a state of war would be implemented. Whiteway's enforcement bill was controversial and unpopular. It split his party and was defeated in 1892 secession. Facing an election with the immediate crisis over, Salisbury decided to not receive or revive the imperial bill. In the meantime, a tussle was developing with Canada. Not only had Newfoundland began to regulate the sale of bait to Canadian vessels, but it had quietly sent a delegate to Washington to explore the possibility of an independent reciprocity treaty. This was done with the permission of the imperial government to make partial amends for browbeating the colony over the French question and encourage cooperation. Unexpectedly, the Newfoundland delegate, Robert Bond, managed in 1890 to negotiate a draft convention behind the back of the British ambassador. The Canadian government furiously, and successfully lobbied against the ratification, and the Newfoundland government was at its turn incensed. Lord Knutsford, the colonial secretary, pointed out to leave the negotiate does not carry obligation or engagement to sanctify the agreement when made, but the Assembly was unimpressed and characterized the failure to ratify the convention as a hostile act calculated to permanently disturb the loyalty for which the colony has been remarkable. And in March, Canadian vessels were denied their bait licenses. The Canadian government demanded imperial intervention while privately raising the possibility of confederation. During the winter of 1891 and 1892, a tariff developed between Newfoundland and Canada, in which ended only the Canadian government threatened to make things difficulty for Newfoundlanders fishing in Canadian waters. A conference between two governments took place in Halifax in November 1892, and it was anticlimactic. The Newfoundlanders were unwilling to discuss confederation, and the Canadians refused to make any concessions. For the moment that Canada had Newfoundland pinned down, the latter could not refuse bait to Canadian fishermen, and could not impose discriminatory tariffs, and apparently could not bargain with the United States without Canadian permission. Newfoundland might have theoretically the same status as Canada, but the conference confirmed that it certainly did not have the same stature. It would appear, wrote Whiteway, that Her Majesty's government, whilst conferring upon this colony a constitution, would desire to withhold it from constitutional rights with our part and parcel of that constitution. If this colony is to be made wholly subservient to Canada, it would be well we should know it. A lack of stature was further demonstrated by the colonial officers' handling of the Newfoundland domestic issues following the 1890s. Officials had experienced enormous frustrations dealing with the colony, which they saw as anomalous imperial nuisance, as on Ireland, which unfortunately had granted home rule, with the political elite perceived as being parochial, incompetent, corrupt, and often unreasonable in dealing with its imperial government. Thus, when the colony's two private banks suspended payment in 1894, participating in a financial crisis might bankrupt the government. The colonial office decided against intervention, and bankruptcy had advantages. The imperial government could step in as receiver and decide whether Newfoundland should be a crown colony administered from London, or a Canadian province, or perhaps a United States state administered from Washington. In an event, responsible government would be over. The Newfoundland government judged Confederation to be a lesser evil and sent a delegation to Ottawa. Since its victories over reciprocity, the Canadian government had lost interest in bringing Newfoundland into Confederation, and was even, in any case, wary of taking responsibility for the French treaty shore. Even so, terms had been agreed in the conservative federal government, been less parsimonious, and the imperial government willing to provide a dowry. Negotiations collapsed, and to the dismay of the colonial government, the colony managed to raise loans that ensured its survival. Tensions between the colony and the imperial government revived in the early 20th century during the premiere of Robert Bond, a nationalist anti-Confederate who, more than any Newfoundland politician leader, was preoccupied by the colony's status with the empire. By 1900, when he took office, France and Britain were beginning to explore the possibility for rapprochement, and the settlement of the Treaty Shore issue was seen as an essential part of the package. To make Bond more flexible, Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary, decided that Newfoundland should be allowed to once try more to obtain reciprocity. Canada objected, but Chamberlain actively noted Sir W. Laurier, who was so strong in adherence of the Home Rule, that he must pay special attention to Mr. Redmond, cannot complain if the principle of Home Rule is followed in the case in Newfoundland. The ploy had negative and positive consequences. In November 1902, Bond and John Hay, the American Secretary of State, designed a draft reciprocity treaty, though Chamberlain was annoyed that Inter Alta Treaty granted the United States the most favored nation status, meaning that Newfoundland could not grant an imperial preference. Official chagrin was tempered by the knowledge that the treaty faced a rough time in the Senate, and for his part, Bond proved to be reasonably cooperative on a settlement with France. The 1904 convention provided that France would give up its ancient fishing rights, but retain a concurrent seasonal fishery with former limits, and though landing on the coast was forbidden. The British government agreed to compensate the owners of French establishments, and reluctantly added territorial concessions in West Africa. The agreement was welcomed in the colony. This island declaimed Bond, which some of us love so dearly despite its backwardness, its isolation, its ruggedness, physical and climate, may henceforth be hailed was one of our native land, but our own land, freed from every foreign claim and blasting influence of foreign oppression, ours entirely, solely ours. The unwelcome repercussions of the U.S. treaty followed its rejection by the Senate in 1905. The Bond government unwisely decided to respond by harassing American fishermen in Newfoundland waters by applying a strict and contentious interpretation of 1818 Convention and using the Bait Act and a new foreign fishing vessels to curtail American participation in the winter herring fishery. When restrictions were opposed in October 1905, the United States government issued a formal protest and the British government immediately intervened. Newfoundland herring would not be allowed to disrupt Anglo-American relations. Bond was preventing from enforcing his policy, and the 1906 imperial government unilaterally imposed a modus vivendi pending an interpretation of the 1818 Convention. This was followed by an imperial order in council forbidding any seizures or arrests of American vessels. Such actions were heavy-handed. Bond claims they constituted a menace to responsible government in the colonies, and justifiably wondered whether London would have treated a more important colony in this way. But he received little, any more sympathy in 1907 colonial conference at the home disputed to Roe's patriotic enthusiasm. The imperial government had shown once more the implementation of international treaties, and British foreign policy as a whole took a precedence over Newfoundland's ambitions. It was some compensation, the award of the Hague Tribunal in 1911, that substantially upheld the British, that is, Canadian and Newfoundland arguments concerning the interpretation of the 1818 Convention and the malleability of American fishermen to local law. But that convention in time precedent was dead, and Bond was no longer Prime Minister. With his political exit and the end of both French and American fishery questions, and defeat of reciprocity, Newfoundland's relationships settled into drab normality that participated until August 1914. For all the quarrels within the imperial government, Newfoundlanders had always seen themselves as loyal members of the great empire. A British society existed from 1834, and the Orange Order, which arrived in 1863 at its peak in 190 lodges, and the first overseas company at the Church Lads Brigade was formed in St. John's in 1892. The first colonial Royal Naval Reserve contingent followed 1900, and the Boy Scouts and the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire appeared in 1910, and the Legion of Frontiersmen the next year. Royal tours to North America always stopped in St. John's, and imperial honors were prized. The Depression intensified Newfoundland's already desperate situation, and by 1932 the government was able to continue full payments on a public debt of approximately $100 million. 1/3 representing the cost of the Great War. Notice of the partial default caused alarm in Ottawa and London, and financial assistance was provided with the Imperial Royal Commission investigated the situation. The Newfoundland Royal Commission, chaired by Baron Amurley, reported in November 1933. Its central recommendation had been scripted by a Whitehall bureaucracy generally concerned about the impact the default by a dominion might have on financial markets, and anxious for a quick solution. Moreover, the Canadian government had made it abundantly clear that it would not provide financial assistance and was not interested in Newfoundland becoming a province, and a solution the Newfoundland debt would be rescheduled and guaranteed by the British government, in effect, a disguised default. But since financial intervention was incompatible with Dominion status, responsible government had to be suspended and replaced by a government appointed by a commission. The rationale minimized the impact of depression, bypassed the cost of the Great War, and emphasized an alleged misgovernment and corruption and financial extravagance. This reflected at least some of the evidence collected in Newfoundland, but also a bureaucratic mindset which mistrusted and disliked local politicians and local politics. On the basis of the report, intervention could be presented to the British Parliament as a benign and construction imperialism. The utilization of an imperial project in Newfoundland, the Army recommendations were greeted on the whole with relief and gratitude. Demoralized by years of economic and financial difficulty, most Newfoundlanders were prepared to accept the apparent failure of independence with almost indecent haste. Without negotiation or hesitation, the government dutifully rammed through the legislature of an address requesting the suspension of responsible government. In February 1934, a commission of 3 Newfoundlanders and 3 British officials, chaired by the governor, took over the administration of what constitutionally a colony, and though still legally Dominion. The commission, which had full legislative and executive powers, was to remain in place, and the legislation specified that until the country was again self-supporting, there was a request for the people for constitutional change. The period of commission government was unique and experimental in the imperial administration. In the rush to avoid default, however, the experiment had not been adequately thought through, and it was unclear, for instance, how much freedom the action of commission was allowed to be, and how far it could implement a program reconstruction reform. In time, the Dominions officially made it clear and exercised supervisory control that it wanted to be a Newfoundland and was progress with economy and advertised publicity. In short, costs were to be controlled, and the local elites that had strongly supported the establishment of the commission accommodated. However, given the persistence of the Depression, balanced budgets proved unattainable, and controversy could not always be avoided. By the late 1930s, the commission was widely unpopular, mainly because it was secretive and failed to fulfill the inflated expectations of which had accompanied its inauguration. Its achievements were real, but unspectacular, necessary and largely bureaucratic. Among them, the reorganization of civil service, tax reform, and improvements in health and education. Most Newfoundlanders could see little improvement over the situation in 1934, and it is likely that the Dominion's office would have to reform the commission system had not war intervened. The war brought prosperity and full employment. American and Canadian forces built large military bases on the island and in Labrador, whose interior boundary, long disputed with Canada, had officially been established in 1927 by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. The construction boom eventually waned, and the economy in general did well, and Newfoundlanders also found work in the mainland and served in the Canadian and British armed forces. There was widespread unhappiness over the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, 1941, which gave the United States government 99-year leases and virtual sovereignty over the base areas, but the Commission had no option to concur. Overall, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador had higher disposable incomes than ever before, and the government generated a higher surplus to enable its interest-free loans to the United Kingdom. There was no question the country was again self-supporting. The events that followed have generated an extensive literature and controversy just this day. The British and Canadian governments agreed in 1945 that their common aim would be to bring Newfoundland into Confederation. Britain had always favored this option, and in this first phase of decolonization, wanted to free the responsibility for Newfoundland. The war had changed Canada's attitude, and there was not a great deal of enthusiasm for the acquisition of another maritime province, as Newfoundland was perceived. But officials now recognized that Canada had long-term essential interests in the region. There was a concern about supposedly growing American influence and the security of the Atlantic coast, and considerable value was placed on Labrador's economic potential. Only Newfoundlanders themselves could bring about the end result, and in 1946 they were soon to be largely anti-Confederate. Thus, the Dominion's office arranged for an election and national convention to consider the country's financial and economic condition, and recommended forms of future government would be placed on a ballot. The convention between September 1946 and January 1948 sent delegations to London and Ottawa, and finally recommended that the referendum choice should be returned to responsible government and continuation of the commission. It rejected a motion to include Confederation. The Dominion's office overturned the recommendation and placed Confederation on the ballot anyway. An intervention which fueled well-founded anti-Confederate suspicions that the deck had been stacked from the outset. The social and economic impact of the Depression and the Second World War had allowed Confederation to become a realistic constitutional option, and many Newfoundlanders were nervous about resuming independence, fearing another collapse and a loss of higher standard of living which they had become accustomed. And it was a war that made Canada genuinely interested in the proposition. But Newfoundlanders believed that they had the resources to underpin a separate existence. And the years that followed had shown prosperity was elusive and that independence was costly. And in the end, a vulnerable and narrowly based economy was unable to sustain a public debt that largely represented two national projects, railway building and the Great War. And in the end, Britain, which Newfoundlanders had always identified seeing themselves as the most loyal of the empire, had become determined to end what had been an imperial anomaly, and small and unrelative, unimportant, precocious colony, a backwater, which was nevertheless entitled to the trappings of responsible government and dominion status. Becoming a province ended the anomaly, but in substituting Ottawa for London, Newfoundland had found a solution.